I'm hoping now that we can just sort of have a discussion about how we see our ability to coordinate data and resources to create more sustainable communities. And the big thread that I see through all these projects is the ways in which we can use data and work with stakeholders to improve outcomes. And also, I also really felt strongly the impact of our ability to use internet resources. So sort of narrowly, because I'm a professor and I'm thinking like a professor, especially during the pandemic, it's easy to think a lot about how critical this was, internet access was for education. And especially if you think about in the north of Canada, how few universities there are, or there's a community college, right? So people have to travel really long distances, and we are able to deliver at least some courses online. So I guess I've just been thinking about this, but also the ways that it impacts students with less resources, right? So at Concordia, we have a summer camp, which is wonderful. We're in the Gina Cody School of Engineering, and we have something called Girl Set. It's free, it's 2 weeks long, and it helps bring girls into STEM. And it's a lot of fun. I did it once in person and twice now online, and it's great. But mostly, these are people who have enough data on their phone, and then I'm trying to teach them agent-based modeling that they're using in a web interface and a phone, or they have a computer at home and they have internet at home. But who am I really getting? I'm getting people who are more advantaged, right? So the ways that internet resources really matter for so many different kinds of access, of educational access, I think is really important. So maybe to start something off there in narrow professor perspective. So I just sort of want to hear your take on that. Dan, you have to start.
Oh, okay. I'll have to agree. I think in a lot of ways, for some of us with the pandemic, we were fortunate and privileged enough to have access. And it allowed us to continue doing many of the things that we would normally do, just in a physically distanced, remote, isolated sort of way. And the lack of internet and connectivity for other communities is substantial, and definitely something that, part of the research that I'm doing is trying to figure out other ways of getting communication tools developed for these sorts of communities and whatnot. But it's absolutely critical in terms of making sure that there's equity and access. And it's not just about having access to the internet, it's making sure that the voices at the various ends of the internet are able to contribute to the conversation as well. And I know there's a lot of work going on with that in terms of whose stories are being told and whatnot. But for me, the work that's happening in Rigolet, that's being led by the community there, it's absolutely critical and has a huge impact on other communities in terms of what they're able to access, how they're able to access things, and the rights that they should have, that all of us take for granted. So yeah, like that's sort of my just a short comment. Like I agree, it's super important, but it's not necessarily moving fast enough from my personal opinion.
I also feel like there's a way in which internet service is still treated as this sort of luxury item, right? And instead of, an essential for being able to access work and education. And, I think especially in Canada, we tend to have fewer providers. And not just in the far north. So it is sort of potentially a bigger issue. But I would love to hear, I think this obviously very much impacts your work, Justin and Katina. If you guys had more to say.
Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, just jumping in here, kind of echoing similar sentiments. During the pandemic, it's very important for internet access to be distributed to all of these communities that might have less resources than others. And specifically like in education, when looking at specifically in Arizona, because that's what I've looked at the most, you could just tell by the resources or the districts with lower income levels, you can just see the difference in resources, how it translates to performance at an educational level. And so it is super important to try to get these resources to communities that need them the most, especially internet access.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Christina, I'm wondering if we can sort of pivot to how the sort of stakeholder engagement and information about different households was able to increase the speed of access. And if you see some other parallels to some of the other kinds of accessibility that we've discussed.
Well, trying to take the conversation still in terms of education, for instance, as you were talking about earlier, one of the, I don't know if advantage is the good word for it, but you know, we have a lot of students that work, especially in impoverished neighborhoods. So one of the benefits that we had when we considered the access for technology and, you know, giving devices and accessibility and internet, we gave a lot of people some new opportunities to engage in education while doing other things, which is something that when we didn't have online platforms was more or less impossible, right? So maybe there is a lot of stuff going on at the same time, like working while listening to a podcast or listening to a class or that kind of thing. And that's interesting in terms of connectivity and in terms of new opportunities for people who used to not have time to go to school, for instance, and now they could while doing other things. But talking about stakeholders, I, as a professor myself, I have some trust in academia. And I think that for too long, academia in many places have stayed mostly isolated. I'm not talking about the people on this table because all examples were beautiful examples about exactly the opposite of what I just said. But I think this is a new trend, so to speak, about academia starting by engaging, starting by learning instead of teaching, right? And that's something that technology in all possible aspects should aim for, right? About giving us tools to better understand what's actually going on and how we could join the discussion in a respectful manner.
I really like what you said about the learning, right? And that how important it is to be collaborative, because it is too easy and we see it all the time, right? Here I am, I'm gonna solve your problem for you. I know how to do this, right? And so I hope this is starting to become more of our training that, you know, we need to engage with stakeholders. But even when people say things like engage with stakeholders, that often isn't the same thing as developing together or learning together. It still is a bit of like the model of saying, well, you don't understand and I do, so let me tell you about it. And that obviously is such a huge challenge, right? It also, there's this big ego problem, right? Which is part of it. But then just really understanding, and I mean, especially like I also have a bit of training in statistics, right? This is kind of like an old thing from, I felt like it was a Guinness problem, right? But there was, I feel like there's a really famous example of some brewer in Ireland kind of saying, this is what you should be doing. I've done some studies and this is definitely how you should manage your crops. I'm killing this story, Dan, you better take over. Basically the farmers are like, this isn't true, you know, because the statisticians just weren't able to know about crops that come up from previous years and take over the field, right? You tell the story better now, okay? Do you know my story? No, anyway, so this is really like key, you know, stakeholders know things that we can't know just because our math is there. That doesn't mean that we know all the parts of the story. So I feel like that's really interesting. And so Juan Sebastian, I feel like you have such a cool perspective because you're coming at this in the academic way with this really nice paper that you put together, but you're also coming at it as an entrepreneur, as an engineer. You know, you have a lot of perspectives here that I think are so important. So I want to hear from you. And also, I'm assuming that you were a Concordia student online too, so you sort of lived this.
Yes, I actually Well, at Canada, we're midwinter. When I started my semester, I did a winter semester at Concordia. I was here in the tropics enjoying the sun, and this was like my first approach actually to my classes was if my background at my first class was actually a virtual background. My first professor actually told me that, and I said, no, I'm in Colombia. This is where we live, and it's the garden of my grandparents' house that seems like a jungle. So my perspective on the way like connectivity can actually access and better develop connectivity for academia and also for entrepreneurship is I focus a lot on the triple helix perspective. It's a perspective where academia, public, like governments, and also the private sector interact as stakeholders to develop these better perspectives. Because, for example, I just talked here to my co-founder of my startup that, for example, Dan's study was on accessibility, like internet speed and accessibility. Here in Colombia, we don't have internet or even electricity in some parts of Colombia. So how all of these social technical problems can be developed and must be developed with all of the stakeholders having this common goal. And what I mentioned in my paper is understanding, but not with that perspective that you talked, Ketra, that was, I know, so you should do it this way. No, it's I know, you know, let's all of us understand and build common knowledge together so that our solutions and technological solutions can actually be better and more sustainable in the future.
And I think it's just really like particularly challenging sometimes for academics to come at problems with that much humility. And I think it's really, really necessary. Katina, I would just love to hear more from you. I'm really excited by all of the work that you put into iStaff, so it's nice to meet you. And
I think I would dovetail from what Juan was saying and talk about the lived experience and professional expertise. And in co-design methodology, we always talk about the respect that's required. And Juan, you have that. You understand what a socio-technical system is. So that's an amazing victory already for an entrepreneur. You understand the triple helix, you understand the quintuple helix, you know, it's growing. Karagiannis's work, for example, in that space where it's not just the intersection of academia, industry, and government, but we go beyond and we look at even nature as part of that helix, the extension. So we almost give nature a voice of an entity, of a person. And in some places, in some jurisdictions now, a river system has a voice in an environmental law context. So imagine talking to the river and saying, River, how are you? What can you tell me? You know, what is your lived experience? And the river says to you, well, you keep polluting me, you know, you keep doing this to me, and look at me, the fish are dying in my body, you know. So it is now going beyond, and even now, the media, non-government organizations, not-for-profits, we're looking towards the public interest technology in socio-technical systems, and we're thinking about sustainability where the human systems interface with the natural systems. And this is that thing that we see in the environment, that we are contributing to a common pool, a public resource, something that is shared, and something that's required for all of us to have sustainability into the longer term. So I think, Juan, you're very innovative. And the fact that you actually respect everybody who has, as Aroba Abbas says, not just a lived experience, but now a lived expertise. You know, for too long, academics have had the power to say, I know, you know, but we know this much. You know, when I look at my parents who were shepherds and they raised crops in Greece before they migrated to Australia, still I take dead plants to my father and he resurrects them at age 85. And I think, you know, you have a green thumb, but it's more than that. He understands the weather patterns inherently by the lived experience. So for me, it's to come back together, to coalesce again, to intersect, because when that triple helix used to be, as Etzkowitz and Leidesdorf described it, disparate, these three disparate blobs. And then we've started to intersect, but we've got to do that now in a transdisciplinary context. And that's where we're moving. High risk, but high reward if we get it right. And the breaking down of the silos, even within our university academic sector, has to happen. So as we start to mimic this intersection, and we truly believe in it, because we know if we don't, we won't have long-term sustainability, I think we're going to yield dividends. But the first thing, as you say, Juan, how can we get on a level playing field without these digital divides increasing over time? So I was very inspired by your talk, Juan, and all the talks. But thank you, Ketra, and it's lovely to meet you too. Thanks for all your support and your hosting.
Well, it's been really fun. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me to be part of organizing ISTAF. So that part's just been amazing. But I want to talk about something that I heard in a panel that I moderated yesterday on automating labor. And one of the speakers talked about really rooting problems in the personal, which I heard you just do, Katina. And so rooting your experience in the personal. And so she talked about, the paper was called Unpacking Meatpacking Through Amazon. And it was just for me really inspiring because she talked about her experience as a child of Mexican immigrants who worked in meatpacking and the kind of danger and human rights violations that go on pretty regularly, and kind of how that informed her as a sociologist and how you think about risk in the workplace. So these are the kinds of things where you see someone who's really been able to take opportunity and grow, but also how do you take those really formative experiences that are personal and inform them, which is often something that we're trained that we're not supposed to do. If we're doing science, if we're doing, especially engineering, we shouldn't be taking our personal and informing our work with the personal. So I like that idea of informing what we do with the personal and with our experiences. And I think that's part of stakeholder engagement to me is that personal and bringing personal in through other people. But we often still kind of put this guard up where I'm here as a professor and I'm not bringing in my personal, but I invite you to bring in your personal because it's your problem really that we're talking about. So I'm just wondering about that, like bringing in the personal and how that works in each of your respective projects, if you care to talk about that.
Sure, I can sort of say a few things on that. I think the idea that we need to bring in the lived experience. We need to respect different ways of knowing the world, different ways of understanding how to process everything that we see and do. I think that's absolutely critical for the work that needs to be done, particularly since most of the big challenges that we face are not going to be solved by a single discipline. Mathematics or statistics is not going to fix climate change. It's not going to fix hunger. We need to have a diversity of experience and understanding and knowledge and expertise in the room. From my point of view, building the personal into the research, as much as we're trained not to, especially, my training is in mathematics and statistics. It can't get any more depersonalized than that, really, in the grand scheme of things. But from my point of view, it's absolutely essential for helping to build the relationships when you're working with a broad team from diverse backgrounds. You need to have that personal component. Whether or not my personal stuff influences the research I do, I would argue that mine probably does, because I need to be passionate about the work that I'm doing. And if I'm not, and I don't see the utility of it, the implications or the effects that it might bring, I don't know that I would necessarily be as engaged with it. I don't know that I'd be able to bring the same thing to the table with the community that I get to work with. I am privileged to work with. So I think it's absolutely essential. And I think it begins with the way we start training and retraining students. We do a really good job of siloing students and giving them the very technical and disciplinary specific skills that they require to be a biologist or a psychologist or a mathematician, whatever it happens to be. But we don't do a good enough job at the undergraduate and even at the graduate level of teaching students how to work in this kind of a setting, how to solve big problems, because we always have to narrow it down to some tiny, tiny little thing that they have to solve. Students don't talk to one another in an academic setting. They talk to similar disciplinary trained students, but they don't sit down with one another. They don't sit with community, generally speaking. So we need to incorporate all this and let the students recognize that their lived experience is just as valuable and important to the work that they're doing as the community members that are connected to the work. So for me, I think it's absolutely essential that we do this and integrate this into the work that we do.
I have a curiosity, if I might ask. You then just mentioned that your education was very scientific, so to speak. What about, going back to the humanities, to teaching ethics and to teaching philosophy and even sociology in an undergrad level? I mean, not just waiting for students to be our grad students and trying to teach them to see the big picture, but trying to encourage the use of those, I hesitate to call them tools, but those ways to approach programs in terms of ethics, of course, but maybe even those big philosophical questions, or just the attitude of being able to ask oneself, okay, what is this really for? What is my role in this whole scenario? And I really appreciate the fact that you said that students only talk to other students in their field, very rarely meet people outside the academic community, or even, interdepartmental school activities. And that's something that academia should, step on, because we are very slow in reaching out other academics in other, areas of knowledge.
I agree. Very, very slow. And often truly interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work is not valued as much as the disciplinary specific work. And it's not just by peers, it's also like when you look at funding opportunities. Like in Canada, we've got the 3 tri-council agencies, one for social sciences, one for natural sciences, and one for health. And my work sort of fits within all 3 of them, but each one of them, if I apply to one, they say, go to the other. And I end up in this lovely circle trying to find funding for the work that we're doing, because it does span multiple disciplines. So I agree, like we need to have more of that communication and a better, more respect and ways of measuring the impact of that kind of work, because it's difficult work. It's very difficult work.
And I mean, you said it so well. It's what pays and what doesn't pay. And as an academic, it pays to be narrow, and it pays to kind of use increasingly fancy approaches in a very narrow way, right? And that doesn't really solve our problems. So if you're an academic, especially talking to young academics, I'm hesitant to say, yeah, work in this interdisciplinary way and really work on solving problems, because if you want to win, now, should you want that? That's a value question that I can't answer, but I mean, really, should you want it? I don't know. But once you're in, and I guess like I'm tenured, so okay, fine, I can do my thing. But when you don't have that, it's very scary, and it's hard to give people that advice. But I think that this is the reason we have such a big gulf between actually solving our problems and academic work. And yeah, Dan, I'm just exactly where you are with the Tri-Council, but anyway. We're almost out of time, but I wonder, I want to hear some more from you, Juan Sebastian.
If I may pitch in, I really liked what Dan told about passion. And I believe in what we do. Myself as a student, as a group, I haven't even graduated from chemical engineering, but it's doing things with passion that generates those interdisciplinary moments. Because if we don't have the passion to do something, we will still be accustomed to working in narrow fields or working with the same people that we learn from. So I actually believe, and I'm really, really thankful for the professors that I had at Concordia and for my professors here in Colombia, because you are key into inspiring young students. You are key to inspire and to let people dream, because university and academic has like these safeguards that you shouldn't like say no to an idea. You shouldn't say no to the goals of a student, and try to encourage and try to keep working on what he wants to do in life, because it's this passion and it's those drivers that actually will make us transform and change the world as a better place that we want to see it.
Well, that's really a flattering place to leave off. That you know, that's very nice to hear, and I think yeah, I think probably speak for everyone when you know, that's the goal, right? That's what we're all hoping to do. So it's really nice to hear. Does anybody else have any final thoughts before we close out? We're right at the end, but I would love to hear any more final thoughts. This has been such a great panel. I'm really honored to have gotten to be, just by happenstance, to get to do this with you. I'm so honored by that.
You've been a wonderful host, Ketra. We just want to thank you as well for the review process and everything that you contributed to ISTES. Thank you so much. What an enjoyable panel, and the humility on the panel, just beautiful to meet all of you live from Australia today.
And Katina, it means so much hearing that from you, because just all of the work that you did doing this last year and seeing all of the cool stuff that you put together, honestly, I'm really inspired by your work. So anyway, and I'm inspired by all of your work. You know, it's just so exciting to hear everything and to be together with you. So from Colombia, from Peru, from Canada, from Australia, from Arizona, how cool. That's amazing. All right, so I'm going to let you guys go. This has been terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Have a great week. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Have
so
a good
much.
one.
Congrats.
Thanks, Ketra.